Everyone, this is Russell Medley, and this is my EDL 855 case study. In section one here, summarizing it, we see an assistant principal, Mr. Richard Inman, who is an assistant principal at Rocket High School. The school is made up of students from different backgrounds. He's also a role model for students who come from the same part of town in which he grew up in. One of those students is James, who is a student who has a troubled background. And Mr. Inman has kind of built a relationship by hanging out with him after school, participating in basketball and things like that, and has slowly started to see some progress with James. However, James is called to the office in 1 week because of some tardies that he's been having. Before or shortly after he gets called to the office, James is seen giving another student something suspicious by a teacher. James and David, the student that James gave the suspicious item to, and an officer all come down to Mr. Inman's office. Turns out that David had some brass knuckles on him and that he was threatened by James to hold them. The officer then puts the students in handcuffs based on them having a felony in possession of a prohibited weapon. And the school also has a zero tolerance policy, which results in expulsion for at least 45 days. So the boys are taken away, and Mr. Inman contacts both mothers. James's mom seems fine with the punishment, that it's going to teach him a lesson, and that's what he needs. David's mother, however, is very upset about this and eventually comes in and sees him in person, and is really upset just in fact because her son was bullied in the situation and that um, this kind of stuff never really happens with David. So Mr. Inman fills out paperwork, but then rips up David's after he kind of reflects on the situation. And that situation is more of a moral struggle of the policy over doing what is right, as well as how it's going to affect David's future. And then finally, it ends with the director of secondary education asking Mr. Inman to complete the paperwork for expulsion, as he's encouraged him to follow the district policy. We're looking at some legal or ethical issues. First of all, it is a felony offense, so possession of a prohibited weapon. The school has a zero tolerance policy saying that the student should be expelled for no less than 45 days, and during this expulsion, they are to attend the district's alternative education program. Bullying is another ethical issue here. And we don't really know this, but what is the school's stance on bullying? And could that somehow impact how the situation is resolved? Some other ethical issues is, was it fair for both students who are involved? This punishment will reflect poorly on David for his future endeavors. And what is the impact on Mr. Inman if he doesn't fill out the paperwork as far as his job security and things like that? So, synthesizing, putting this all into one sentence, what is happening? Mr. Inman is trying to decide whether David should be held to the school policy guidelines on possession of a prohibited weapon, even though he was bullied into holding it by another student. So now we look at the facts, what we know about the situation. First, starting with the people, we know Mr. Richard Inman, who's a first year teacher who grew up in this community, particularly the South Side, and he likes to reach out and build relationships with students who are struggling. James is the student, a 15-year-old athletic student who kind of has a troubled history and issues with attendance. And he gives the brass knuckles to David in a threatening way, telling him to hold on to him for him. David is a student that the brass knuckles are given to. He's an honor student involved in band, bullied by James, and throughout the situation, it's mentioned how he's very nervous and upset about the situation and the potential consequences. The officer that is in the office as well, immediately when the brass knuckles were found, followed policy by handcuffing David. James's mom is mentioned, and she seems fine with the punishment. David's mom is angry over the situation, and then the director of secondary education also appears at the end and expects the policy to be followed as far as the zero tolerance goes. As far as the place, this takes place at Rocket Junior High School, which has 900 students and in a community with a lot of diversity. As far as the program, the disciplinary alternative education program is a program just for students who are expelled for at least 45 days. And then also the district zero tolerance policy, which ultimately results in students being put into the DATE program. Some things that are unknown. We don't really hear anything mentioned about other administrators as far as the principal of the school or the superintendent, or any guidance on the situation that could be given to Mr. Inman. The Board of Education, they're the ones obviously who have to approve the district policies, and so we don't know kind of where they're at on the situation. As far as the place, we really don't know. We get the feeling that it's a diverse community, but we don't really know the full makeup of the community in terms of race, socioeconomic status, and things like that. There's no mention of other schools in the district that may have had similar situations happen, and how they've encountered those situations. And then as far as programs that are unknown, the bullying policies, we don't hear anything mentioned on that. It's mentioned that, Mr. Inman works with James after school, and so it kind of made me wonder if there were different programs in place or clubs that students can be involved in after school, besides just teachers on their own taking the time to be with students outside the school day. And then also, if there's any school resources for students to go to report bullying, or what the education is for students to kind of know how to handle those different situations. So in reviewing and prioritizing the information, we look at the impact on all the stakeholders involved. Mr. Inman, the decision that he makes can ultimately impact his job and his job security. James seems to have made progress, but how will this setback impact him moving forward? Will the relationship between him and Mr. Inman dissolve because of this issue? Um, David is a student who has not had a prior history of any negative behavior, and with this on his record, it could hurt him in his future endeavors. Any other administration, we don't get us hear about them at all, and if they've been contacted on this situation. And then also, who could Mr. Inman talk to explain the situation and coming up with a decision that is fair for all who are involved? And so I really do think that there's more information that would be needed before making a decision. So in looking at the different options and the consequences of those options that Mr. Inman could choose to take, or what I would take as a school administrator, the first thing is to do nothing. And so, we are mentioning we don't have all the facts and things like that. Some of the consequences of doing nothing, though, you get continued pressure from the director of secondary education to complete the paperwork. And if he does nothing, then it may impact his job security. Another option would be to fill out the paperwork for both James and David, expelling them from school. David will have charges on his record that may impact his future endeavors. And Mr. Inman might also feel some guilt in that the student was not fairly cheated. Maybe it goes against his moral compass. He could have a meeting with other administrators explaining the situation. However, this may look like Mr. Inman is not adequate in doing his job, and they may still, at the end of the day, expect him to still fill out the paperwork. He could also not fill out the paperwork out on both David and James, kind of just forget the whole situation happened. However, that does not align with the board policies. Mr. Inman may lose credibility, and this does not really teach anything to David or James about being responsible for their actions. And then finally, he could fill out the paperwork for James, but not David. Once again, this kind of on paper just seems like it goes against the board policies. So now we're evaluating our different options. First of all, in doing nothing, the pros of this would allow more time to kind of think more about the issue at hand, continue to kind of gather information and things like that, so you can kind of get a better understanding of what's happening. The cons of this, though, is that the continued pressure from the director of secondary ed to complete the paperwork, and once again, I mentioned kind of the impact it might have on his job performance and job security. And filling out the paperwork for both James and David, expelling them both. The pros would be that he's following district policy and the decision is dealt with and no longer a problem for myself as the administrator. Cons, though, is that it may fracture the relationship between James and Mr. Inman. It may also hurt David's school and legal record that may hurt him in the long run. He could have a meeting with other administrators and board to explain the situation. The pros would be that it comes to a solution that factors in bullying and its relationship to the zero tolerance policy. There also could be some dialogue that can help strengthen the school policies in place. And then the group could ultimately agree to not expel David. However, some cons would be that Mr. Inman may be viewed as not capable of doing his job, and the group may decide to continue with both David and James being expelled. In not filling out the paperwork for David, the pros would be that the situation would be resolved. However, and James and Mr. Inman can work to strengthen the relationship and keep James out of trouble. David will not be impacted negatively for anything going against his record. The cons of this would be to not this would not be following the school policy, especially in front of the officer there. There would be some moral internal conflict as well with Mr. Inman as far as not doing what is fair to the students. And then finally, the last option would be to fill out the paperwork for James but not David. The pros would be that this seems to align more with Mr. Inman's moral compass, and also that David will not be punished or have a stain on his record. The cons, though, is that once again, this goes against the board policy as it stands. That could affect his job, and this may open a crack for future instances to get out of discipline. So in choosing the best option, I kind of picked a hybrid choice, kind of a mesh of some of the different options there. First of all, I would do nothing until I could gather all the information on the incident. I want to make sure I know exactly what's happening, who's involved. I think I don't want to make an emotional decision. I want to make sure I think through everything clearly. I also want to have a meeting with the administration to gather their input in finding the solution that fits the situation. Hopefully, this would result in James getting expelled, but not David, due to the threatening that happened against David. If the decision rests with me, then I would fill out the paperwork on James, but not for David. So implementing my decision, not making a decision based on emotions. So I'm going to get all the facts. I would quickly schedule a meeting with the admin team, explain the situation, refer to the bullying policies, and I would really try to come to terms with what is fair to all stakeholders. If the decision rests with me, I'm going to have a meeting with James. I'm going to explain the rationale behind my decision. I'm going to share a personal message about my disappointment in his actions, but pride in doing what was right because he ultimately confessed that he did threaten David into holding those. I would fill out the paperwork to expel James, but stay in touch to try and keep our relationship intact. I would also have a meeting with David. I would explain the seriousness of the situation. I would show him the different resources that he could have turned to, talk about what we're going to do in the future, and then I would not fill out the paperwork on David. If the administrative team felt that I needed to expel both students, I think this would be the hard thing, is that really evaluate my job, my role, and my future employment. I'm kind of having that internal battle between what direction my personal compass points versus kind of the organizational policies. I would respectfully decline to sign off on the expulsion, and then I would just have to live with the consequences for that action. Finally, I would want to work with stakeholders to update policies as it relates to bullying and zero tolerance policies, and just having that clarity and steps to take in the future before we just jump right to expulsion. So that's all I have for this case study. Thank you very much.